Last year, we were the first financial site to explain how the Shemitah 7-year cycle would have an important and disastrous effect on the markets. The Shemitah ended in the third quarter of last year, and just as we predicted, it was the worst quarter in worldwide stock markets since the last Shemitah in 2008. Since then, we've been the leader in explaining further Shemitah trends embedded in the once every 49-year Jubilee year. The Jubilee year ends on October 2nd of this year, and we expect even worse events to occur as October approaches. But now, famous investor Jim Rogers has just released a new warning saying the same. He's even using biblical references to warn of a financial tsunami that could take place either this year or next. He has just said a $68 trillion biblical collapse is poised to wipe out millions of Americans. Rogers co-founded the Quantum Fund with George Soros in the early 1970s. The fund generated returns of 4,200% over 10 years and made fortunes for both men. Soros and Rogers, having worked together for so long, probably both have access to information the regular person doesn't. Soros recently was in the news for shorting the stock market and making gold his largest held asset and predicting an impending crisis. Now, just this week, Jim Rogers has said the same and was quite outspoken about how it was written in the Bible. He referred to a quote from the book of Joshua. "You are under a curse now. You will always be servants. You will be woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God." The amount of people joining the bandwagon predicting imminent collapse of a biblical proportion is getting nearly lopsided, especially considering that it was less than a year ago that we were one of the only people talking about it. Carl Icahn, Stanley Druckenmiller, and Soros himself, to name a few. Each of these individuals has now placed significant funds in gold and gold-related securities. Soros has gone so far as to actively short the stock market. Their messages are similar to Rogers, who sees economic turmoil descending that will actually bankrupt whole nations. Rogers believes the situation is much worse than 2008, when major economies had dollar resources in reserve. Those countries like China and Japan have spent down much of their reserves. Thus, it won't just be the US or Europe that suffers from the next wave of market insolvency. This time, the entire world is going to be relatively helpless. There are not going to be patches of prosperity like in 2008. He predicts that the UK will collapse while countries like Italy will face bankruptcy. He's pointed out that stock market breadth began to contract in the middle of 2014 and hasn't ceased. This calls for the only remedy that Wall Street knows: additional money printing. But right now, the Fed is trying to move in the opposite direction toward tightening. What central bank officials see as recovery, however, is merely the result of artificial money printing and debt expansion. The looming disaster that is about to hit is imminent because in the US, recoveries don't last more than 7 years at the outside. Rogers' perception that the upcoming catastrophe has a historical or biblical element remind us of statements by a top executive for the International Bank for Settlements, William White. We quoted him here as follows: "The only question is whether we are able to look reality in the eye and face what is coming in an orderly fashion, or whether it will be disorderly. Debt jubilees have been going on for 5,000 years, as far back as the Sumerians. The next task awaiting the global authorities is how to manage debt write-offs, and therefore a massive reordering of winners and losers in society without setting off a political storm." Rogers has stated that $68 trillion could be wiped off the earth and millions of Americans as well. It could actually be worse than that. This is the end of the monetary system as we know it, and will result in life as we know it changing forever. And it's all been planned. If you haven't seen our video exposing the elite Jubilee plan to completely reorder the world, perhaps as soon as this coming October, you should see it immediately. You can see it at surviveshemitah.com. There is probably not much more time to prepare. Given what is now being predicted by billionaires and investment gurus alike, if you aren't prepared now, or soon, it may be too late. We've already made massive gains by seeing things ahead of the crowd, and will likely make even bigger ones in the future. But the key will not be just what to buy, but how, when, and where. Surviving a biblical collapse is not going to be easy for anyone. There is no roadmap for something like this. But we've been ahead of the curve in figuring out what is coming, and we've been ahead of the curve in coming up with innovative ideas, information, and solutions to help you protect yourself and your family. You can get access to all of our resources, information, and advice by subscribing to the Dollar Vigilante newsletter at dollarvigilante.com/subscribe. I've been called crazy more than anyone I've ever known or even heard about. I was called crazy for saying the internet would revolutionize the world in 1993 before most even knew what it was. I was called crazy for quitting my job at a bank to start an internet company in 1994 that rose to a high of $240 million. I was called crazy for saying the US housing market would collapse in 2005. I was called crazy for starting the Dollar Vigilante in 2010, predicting a US dollar and worldwide fiat currency collapse within a decade, and it's now the fastest growing financial newsletter in the world. I was called crazy for saying Bitcoin would change the world of money when it was $3 in 2011. It's currently at $450 and changing the world of money. And I was called crazy last summer when I said we are incredibly close to outright collapse of a scope that the world has never seen. Now, you can include George Soros, Jim Rogers, Stanley Druckenmiller, Carl Icahn, and the Bank of International Settlements' William White as being crazy just like me.